Good day all. This talk will examine British superheroes from ancient times to modern times. As in my other talks, I shall argue that these superheroes are all variations on two basic archetypes, the strong man and the wise man. I shall begin my history after the fall of the Roman Empire in the early 5th century AD. This collapse of central authority led to a wave of new wars throughout Europe, which provided opportunities for new superheroes to emerge. In northwest Europe, the Anglo-Saxon tribes of Germany immediately decided to expand into Britain, so they invaded. By the year 500, they had established permanent settlements in southeast England, and by 650, they had conquered most of England. The old Celtic peoples were driven into Scotland and Wales, which were more difficult to conquer, mostly because they were both so mountainous, whereas England is mostly flat plains. This means that the 6th and early 7th centuries were a period of almost constant warfare between the Celts and the Anglo-Saxons. As they struggled to defend their homeland against the invaders, the Celts invented not just a superhero to lead them, but a supergroup: King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. At some point in the 6th century, according to legend, Arthur gathered the best, the bravest, and the most chivalrous knights in England to fight for him. And together they forged the kingdom of Camelot to stand against the Anglo-Saxons. Most historians believe that although Arthur was fictional, he was based on a real king who united the Celtic tribes. The story of the Round Table tells us that he did this not by conquering all the others, but by uniting them in a coalition where he was first among equals. He was the leader, but major decisions were made by all the tribal chiefs together, sitting round the table. Similar strategies have been used by kings the world over when they're not in a strong enough position to just rule by decree. Arthur became leader of the Celts by establishing himself as a strong man. According to legend, he was made king because he was the only one who could pull the sword from the stone. This tells us that in practice he became king because he was a great swordsman, a great fighter, as usual. No one knows for sure why the sword came from a stone, but the real-life king who united the Celts supposedly had his headquarters in Tintagel Castle, which still stands in England to this day. I have actually visited Tintagel, and I can tell you that it stands on a large rocky promontory, basically a single giant slab of stone, which would have made it very difficult to attack. When the Celtic army rode out of this castle, they would have been swords coming out of the fortress on the stone. So, when Arthur led them, he pulled the swords from the stone. Whether this explains the legend or not, in practice, what mattered was that once Arthur was made king, he was very successful in battle. He protected his people, both by fighting off the invading Anglo-Saxons and by killing the traditional monsters, including dragons, giants, witches, cat monsters, and so on. But every supergroup has to have a strong man and a wise man. Camelot's wise man was, of course, Merlin. The relationship of King Arthur and Merlin was not that of superhero and super sidekick, but of two superheroes, the strong man and the wise man. Arthur was technically Merlin's king and was the better fighter, but Merlin was a father figure to Arthur and, with his magic, was in some ways more powerful than Arthur. In social terms, they symbolized the partnership in the ruling class between the military aristocracy and the priesthood. Merlin represented the old English priesthood, the Druids, who preached the old English religion, Wicca. The invading Anglo-Saxons were Christian. So, the ethnic conflict was also a conflict of two different religions. The old religion still had more room in it for magic than the more formalized Catholic Church. But what Arthur really needed from Merlin was not magic, but legitimation. The people had to know that he had the backing of the priests before they would accept him as their king. Still, Merlin has become known as history's greatest magic man or magician, the male counterpart to the magic woman or witch. The only problem with Arthur and Merlin is that despite all their supposed power and all their supposed successes, in the end, they lost. The Celts were driven out of England, and Christianity eventually replaced Wicca throughout Britain. The Anglo-Saxon invasion of Britain is also connected to the other great superhero of the 6th century, Beowulf. We know of Beowulf because of an epic poem that was written in England around the year 1000. Just as the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest surviving piece of literature in the world, the Epic of Beowulf is the oldest surviving piece of literature in the English language. In other words, literature in both places began with superhero stories. However, although the version we have was written in England in the 10th century, it concerns events that took place in Scandinavia in the 6th century. Historians and archaeologists believe that there is quite substantial evidence that Beowulf was based on a real person, and that the story made its way from Scandinavia to England with the invading Anglo-Saxons. Beowulf was the last superhero to achieve his fame primarily by killing a monster, Grendel. Grendel was terrorizing a local community, so Beowulf sailed there with about a dozen soldiers and killed it. The only problem was that Grendel's mother then attacked them to get revenge for her dead son, so he had to kill her as well. Grendel is only ever described as big and scary, so we're not sure what sort of monster he was supposed to be. It has been suggested that he was actually a berserker. Berserkers were real Norse warriors who worked themselves up into a frenzy before battle and turned themselves into killing machines. Some kings actually used these, although of course the problem was that they were very difficult to control. Once they started killing, they just wanted to kill everybody, including their own side. Grendel may have been an out-of-control berserker. As for Grendel's mother, she is more difficult to explain. She is an example of the evil strong woman supervillain. But this kind of bloodthirsty warrior woman did not really exist in Scandinavian society. Perhaps a grieving mother did kill somebody, and she was called a monster precisely because women did not normally act like that. After killing Grendel and his mother, Beowulf became a famous hero and was soon made a king who ruled wisely for 50 years. At the end of his life, his kingdom was threatened by a dragon. Beowulf killed the dragon, but then died of his wounds. One last heroic victory and sacrifice, like Samson. Beowulf and Arthur seem to have pretty much killed off the last of the dragons between them, because after the 7th century, we hear very little more about them in folklore. In case you're wondering, Britain's patron saint, the famous St. George, who also killed a dragon, supposedly did so in the 3rd century, so he came earlier. The decline in dragons and other monsters took place because, by the 7th century, most of Europe, Asia, and Africa had been settled. Dragons represented the dangers of the unknown. Early map makers would draw maps of settled territories, but once they got to the areas where people didn't go very often and that they knew nothing about, they just wrote, "Here be dragons." But by the 7th century, there were people everywhere. There were no more unknown lands where dragons supposedly lived. Ultimately, this represents humanity's conquest over nature. Agricultural society cultivated the land, got rid of the dangerous wild animals, and made nature into something that served humanity instead of something that humanity had to fear. Beowulf was the first great hero of Scandinavian society. His legend helped to establish the power of the Germanic peoples, who were at first called Vikings, which means raiders, and then Norsemen, which means men from the north. Their society flourished from the 8th to the 12th centuries. As Norse society grew, they adopted and made their own versions of Roman gods and superheroes, who were in turn copies of Greek gods and superheroes. Where the Greco-Roman gods lived on Mount Olympus, the Norse gods lived in Asgard. The Norse gods were a supergroup, who, as usual, were led by a wise man and a strong man. The wise man was Odin, the All-Father, who's generally seen as a combination of Mercury or Hermes and Jupiter or Zeus. The strong man was Thor, who's generally seen as based on Hercules, with Thor's hammer being an update of Hercules' club. In some versions of the myth, Thor was Odin's son. In others, he was Odin's chief rival for the throne of Asgard. Altogether, the Norse had 16 major gods and 8 major goddesses. I am not going to go through all of them, but each of them had their own specialty or superpower. And just as with the Greek gods, most of the men were different kinds of warriors, while most of the women were goddesses of love, family, fertility, and the harvest. The gods of Asgard have of course been turned into modern-day superheroes by Marvel, through the character of Thor, god of thunder, whom I shall have more to say about in later talks. Back in England, after Arthur, the next great English folk hero to emerge was Robin Hood, who also had his own supergroup, his Merry Men. Robin Hood supposedly lived around the year 1260. Historians believe that Robin Hood is a fictional character, but that he was based on several real-life bandit chiefs of the time. As their exploits were told and retold, they were eventually all lumped together and attributed to Robin Hood. To understand Robin Hood, we need some social background. The last time England was successfully invaded was in 1066, when the Normans, led by William the Conqueror, defeated the English aristocracy. This conquest led to centuries of ethnic conflict between the Normans, who are from France, and England's Anglo-Saxons. The aristocracy were unhappy because a lot of them lost their land to the Normans, while the common people resented paying taxes to a lord and king who couldn't even speak their language. This is the type of situation that gives rise to what's termed social banditry. This is something that's been observed the world over. When you have an oppressive ruling class, usually from a different ethnic group than the majority, then a lot of people get officially labeled as bandits, even though their only real crime is not accepting the Lord's authority in some way. If they don't want to be imprisoned or executed, a lot of those people run away. And in agrarian society, there are only two places to run where you can hide: the mountains or the forest. When Sicily was conquered by mainland Italy, a lot of people fled to the mountains and formed an outlaw organization so strong that it's still with us, the Sicilian Mafia. In England, there aren't so many mountains, so people hid in the forests, like Sherwood Forest. What distinguishes social banditry from regular banditry is that the bandits are considered criminals by the authorities, but not so much by the common people. Social bandits had family and friends among the local peasants who would know that they'd not really done anything wrong except to stand up to the hated foreign rulers in some way. So social bandits would have the support of the local communities to varying degrees. Robin Hood and his men supposedly robbed the rich and gave to the poor. Well, in practice, they were poor, so whatever they stole, they kept for themselves. And they'd rob whoever they could, except that they'd not steal from the local common people, firstly because they were their family and friends, and secondly because that would lose them their support. And that is how Robin Hood could be an outlaw, but also a folk hero. What distinguishes Robin Hood from most ancient superheroes is that they were either lifelong aristocrats or rose up through the ranks to join the aristocracy. Only Robin Hood did it the other way round. He was supposedly born into the aristocracy as Robin of Locksley, but when he went on the Crusades, the Normans stole his land and stripped him of his title. As I said, something like this did indeed happen to many Anglo-Saxon nobles. This is why Robin Hood could stand as a symbol of the resentment of both the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and the peasants. Robin Hood was not a nation builder or empire builder, but the opposite. He was a voice of protest against empire builders. Like Arthur, he was a national symbol standing against foreign invaders. As a former aristocrat who had fought in the Crusades, Robin Hood had superior military skills and leadership skills. Although he was a great fighter, he was still more a wise man than a strong man. We see this at the very beginning of Robin Hood's banishment, when he meets Little John, who is, of course, the biggest and strongest of all the outlaws. Robin Hood defeats Little John, not through superior strength, but through superior skill. The wise man defeats the strong man. This is partly reminiscent of David and Goliath, but is actually more like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, who became great friends once they were done beating each other up. Little John was the strong man of the merry men, but the leader of the supergroup, as always, was the wise man, Robin Hood. The other merry men, as usual, each had their own specialty. Will Scarlet was an expert swordsman. Alanadale was a minstrel, an updated version of Orpheus from the Argonauts. Friar Tuck provided religious legitimation, which any leader back then needed, and so on. Robin Hood introduced a new kind of superhero, the vigilante superhero, the superhero who operates outside the law but has his own code of justice. While he was a knight in the Crusades, Robin of Locksley was a traditional war hero. But after the war, in peacetime, as Robin Hood, he became much more like a modern superhero. Because superheroes are vigilantes. They step in when the law fails. Robin Hood stepped in because the law served the interests of the Norman aristocracy, not the common English people. Modern superheroes step in because the police just cannot cope with modern urban crime. Robin Hood provides a transition figure between ancient superheroes and modern superheroes. His journey from aristocrat and soldier to commoner and vigilante is the same journey undertaken by superheroes as a whole in the transition from ancient wartime heroes to modern peacetime heroes. The social background to this transition is that from agricultural feudalism to industrial capitalism, where the aristocracy sought to wage war and conquer, the capitalist class creates businesses to make money. So, where ancient superheroes were created partly to legitimize the political rule of the aristocracy, modern superheroes were created primarily to make money. Where ancient superheroes were about the battlefield, modern superheroes are more about the marketplace. Ancient superheroes were created as legends, told and retold. Modern superheroes are created as fiction, bought and sold for a price. But fiction, like any media product, must give its audience what they want in order to sell. Now, in wartime, people want to hear or read stories of war. But in peacetime, they want stories set in peacetime. So, superheroes had to be assigned a new civilian social role. The civilian organization that is closest to the military is the police. The police are a paramilitary structure. Like the military, the police have ranks and strict lines of authority. They're both authorized by society to use force, and above all, they're both protectors of society. The army protects society from external threats. The police protect society from internal threats. So, in protecting society, most modern superheroes have in effect become super police or super cops. They usually call themselves crime fighters. The basic social role of the modern superhero is therefore that of a civilian assistant to the police. They function as an adjunct to the criminal justice system. In social terms, this means that the superhero's social role has changed from king to police officer. That is actually quite a demotion. The role of expert advisor to the police was established by the first modern superhero who was British, Sherlock Holmes. Holmes, of course, fits into the wise man tradition, but he was created by a specific author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and he made his first appearance in 1887. Like ancient superheroes, Holmes was inspired by a real person, but only to a limited extent. In 1877, Doyle met Dr. Joseph Bell, who was not a detective, but a surgeon, but who was known for meticulously observing people and telling everything about them just from their clothes and mannerisms. Doyle basically inserted this character into the detective genre, which had essentially been founded by Edgar Allan Poe in the 1840s. Holmes was a private detective and also a consulting detective or civilian expert advisor to the police. The expert advisor is a useful role because it gives the hero the legitimacy and backup provided by the police, while giving him the freedom not to have to follow police procedures or police rules. In recent years, the civilian advisor has become very popular on TV cop shows such as Castle, The Mentalist, Lie to Me, and even with supernatural advisors on Sleepy Hollow and Lucifer. These days, even the devil has been reimagined as a latter-day Sherlock Holmes. But to this day, I think Holmes maintains his reputation as the smartest detective of all time. Holmes' ability to pay attention to minute details and thereby see things that nobody else could see, in effect turned his intelligence into a superpower. He is often portrayed as holding a magnifying glass. Because he's focusing on something so small that nobody else has even realized it's there. But Holmes knows it is the clue that will solve the case. These days, CSI labs have not just magnifying glasses, but all kinds of technology that looks at microscopic evidence. Holmes was the forerunner and inspiration for forensic science, both in reality and on TV. Like other superheroes, Holmes died but came back from the dead. Doyle killed off Holmes in 1893. His main reason for doing so seems to have been that plotting Holmes's intricate stories took a lot of work and a lot of time, and Doyle wanted to write other things. But the British public's reaction to Holmes' death was unprecedented. 20,000 readers promptly cancelled their subscriptions to the magazine in which Holmes' stories had appeared. Some people started wearing black armbands in mourning. And Doyle received a deluge of fan mail demanding he write more Holmes stories. Doyle resisted public pressure for 8 years, but in 1901 he brought Holmes back with the explanation that Holmes had faked his death to fool his enemies. Doyle continued to write Holmes stories until his death, and since then, of course, many other authors have written new Holmes stories for every medium. By the 1990s, there were over 25,000 books, movies, stage plays, radio plays, TV shows, and video games featuring Holmes. According to Guinness World Records, Sherlock Holmes is, quote, the most portrayed human literary character in film and TV history. Holmes temporarily died by going over Rickenbach Falls in Switzerland, which really do exist, while struggling with his archenemy, Professor James Moriarty. If Holmes was the first modern superhero, then Moriarty was the first modern supervillain. As Holmes was a wise man, so Moriarty was an evil wise man. He was a criminal mastermind who was described as the Napoleon of crime. This was a phrase which the British police had used to describe Adam Worth, the real-life criminal mastermind on whom Moriarty was based. So, both Holmes and Moriarty were based on real-life wise men. One good, one bad. I would argue that it was no coincidence that the greatest superhero and the greatest supervillain of the 19th century were both British wise men. In the 19th century, the British Empire was the biggest empire in the world, and Britain was the world's greatest superpower. As we saw in the ancient world, the citizens of superpowers tend to come to see themselves as superior people. And in the 19th century, British culture cultivated this feeling of superiority. The British saw themselves as superior to all of these peoples that they'd conquered around the world. And the British had established their superiority not through their muscles, but through their brains. Britain had pioneered the Industrial Revolution. British ingenuity had invented the industrial weapons, the gunboats and cannons, that allowed them to conquer pre-industrial societies with relative ease. That is why the great British superhero was not a strong man, but a wise man. Holmes was simply smarter than everyone else. And that's how the British saw themselves, in particular the British upper class. In the 20th century, the British Empire collapsed. But the British superiority complex lingers to this day in their international reputation for snobbishness, which is gradually fading. Our history has now reached the 20th century. The first superhero of the 20th century was also an Englishman. This was the Scarlet Pimpernel, created in 1903 by the British Baroness Orczy. The Scarlet Pimpernel is widely recognized as the first ever hero with a secret identity. His name was Sir Percy Blakeney, an English baronet who pretended to be just a foolish playboy, but who was actually the head of a secret organization dedicated to rescuing French aristocrats from the guillotine. The series was set back in 1792 during the French Revolution. He did not wear a mask, but instead he was a master of disguise, and he always outwitted his opponents. This establishes him as a wise man, not a strong man. Indeed, he's the first of a new subtype of wise man, the mystery man. Many more mystery men would follow, as we shall see. And indeed, all superheroes who maintain secret identities are mystery men or women. The Scarlet Pimpernel got his code name because he always left behind a card with a picture of a Scarlet Pimpernel, which is a small flower, to let the French know that he'd got the better of them again. The Pimpernel was another superhero of the aristocracy, appearing to save them in their time of greatest danger, the French Revolution. He was a throwback, a form of aristocratic wish fulfillment. He was not based on any real person. Baroness Orczy, as a member of the British aristocracy, was of course sympathetic to the French aristocracy, and moreover was known for her belief in the superiority of the aristocracy as personified by the Pimpernel. As for her English audience, they got to laugh at the French, as the English aristocrat outwitted the French authorities over and over. He was another symbol of British ingenuity, like Holmes, appearing at a time when the British Empire, like the French aristocracy, was already in decline. As the British Empire faded and disappeared in the 20th century, fewer British superheroes appeared. However, two more British superheroes were created that have had a major international impact. The first of these is Bond, James Bond. Bond was created by Ian Fleming and debuted in 1953. Bond is a reserve commander in the Royal Navy and an intelligence officer in the Secret Intelligence Service MI6, which is a real branch of the British government. Bond was based on Fleming's real-life experiences. In World War II, he was an officer in Britain's Naval Intelligence Division, and he has said that Bond is a compound of all the secret agents he met there, which included his own brother. So Bond is an updated version of the traditional war hero, a super spy who symbolizes the work of all real-life secret agents. As a spy, he's a mystery man, and as a government agent fighting against his country's enemies with his famous license to kill, he is in effect a soldier fighting in peacetime. Bond, of course, has no superpowers, just superior fighting abilities and his famous gadgets. Bond came after Batman, but before Iron Man, and so was one of the first superheroes to use super technology, a high-tech man, a new type of wise man whom I shall have more to say about later. The final British superhero I want to look at is the one that I watched debut at the age of 7 in England in 1963, and who's gone on, Superman or no Superman, to be the greatest superhero in all of time and space. Who am I talking about? Doctor Who, or more correctly, the Doctor. His title immediately establishes him as a wise man, although we're never told just what he's a doctor of. Doctor Who, which is made by the BBC, is the most successful British TV series of all time. The London Times newspaper once called it, quote, quintessential to being British. And yet, Doctor Who was created by a Canadian, Sidney Newman. Born in Toronto, he went to work in Britain in the late 1950s and became the BBC's head of drama in 1962. He was a lifelong science fiction fan, and the Doctor is the most prominent example of another subtype, the science fiction wise man. The Doctor is an alien, a Time Lord from the planet Gallifrey. He has no superpowers except for the ability to regenerate when he dies, which means that Doctor Who could literally go on forever. He is another high-tech man because his TARDIS is a ship which gives him the ability to travel anywhere in space or time, and he uses other super technology like his sonic screwdriver. Doctor Who has made the transition to books, comics, movies, and other media, and in 2018 also made the transition to being played by a woman, Jodie Whittaker, which made the Doctor the first transgender TV superhero, following in the footsteps of his archenemy the Master, who in 2014 regenerated as Missy. However, in 2022, the Doctor went back to being a man. I would argue that the Doctor is an updated Sherlock Holmes. Each of them is always by far the smartest person in the room. Each of them always has to use their brains to solve a puzzle and defeat the bad guy. And each of them has become a symbol of British ingenuity. It's just a bit ironic that the last great British superhero was invented by a Canadian. That concludes what I have to say on British superheroes. A transcript of this talk is attached if you're interested. Good day.